Jerusalem, the emanation of the great Albion. Can it be? Is it a truth that the learned have explored? Was Britain the primitive seat of the patriarchal religion? If it is true, my title page is also true, that Jerusalem was and is the emanation of the giant Albion. It is true, and cannot be controverted. Ye are united, O ye inhabitants of earth, in one religion, the religion of Jesus, the most ancient and eternal and everlasting gospel. The wicked will turn it to wickedness, and the righteous to righteousness. Amen. All things begin and end in Albion's ancient Druid rocky shore. Your ancestors derived their origin from Abraham, Haber, Shem, and Noah, who were Druids. As the Druid temples, which are the patriarchal pillars and oak groves over the whole earth, witness to this day. You have a tradition that man anciently contained in his mighty limbs. All things in heaven and earth, this you received from the Druids. That was taken from the poem Jerusalem, the emanation of the great Albion, by Willaim Blake. Blake was a contemporary to Iolo and other antiquaries who were involved in the remembrance of the Druidic tradition. He would become the Archdruid of Britain between 1799 and his death in 1827. Blake felt that it was necessary for Britain to remember itself in the face of the emergence of the dark satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution. And the potent shamanism in his work is helpful in mapping the architecture of this hidden and forgotten Albion. In the section of Jerusalem that I read, named to the Jews, Blake situates ancient Britain as the inheritors of both the ancient antediluvian or pre-flood religion and the Israelite tradition, as well as the progenitors of Christianity. This video is going to explore how all of those elements have contributed to Britain and Ireland's religious and spiritual heritage. Blake's allusion to Noah takes us naturally to the flood, an event which is recorded 300 times by different tribes and nations worldwide. Noah was a descendant of Enoch, the antediluvian patriarch who was so virtuous as a human that God took him into heaven to have him guard his throne. The reason this is relevant for Druids and Druidry is because Enoch's virtues resided in agriculture, astrology, writing, and metalwork, all of which were and are Druidic relics. Enoch prophesied the flood during his life, and in the apocryphal book of Enoch, he would come down to earth in angelic form and share his knowledge to the new post-flood population, which correlates with the Hebrew root of the name Enoch, which means to train, initiate, dedicate, and inaugurate. An element of this would have been the astrological knowledge for which he is renowned. In Gwynedd, North Wales, the place names of an ancient landscape star map remembers Enoch's legacy. Cadir Idris, which translates to the chair of Idris. Idris is another name for Enoch. Researcher Huw Evans identifies the immaculate correspondence between peaks of mountains in this area with the star constellations found in the zodiac at Cadir Idris. As if the landscape acts as a land map in line with the Hermetic principles of as above, so below. This provides us with enough evidence to question the established view of where the constellation system came from, and make the argument that this system was a British and Druidic export due to the based evidence which dismisses the idea that the zodiac constellations were arbitrarily chosen. Given that the Druids were the operative priests in the area, it is fair to surmise that they were the ones who recorded this landscape sky alignment. The link between Enoch and astrology is remembered in the landscape and place names of Wales. Blake's poem reminds the reader that Britons have a tradition which is inextricably linked with the antediluvian patriarchs, and makes special reference to the line of Noah, of which Enoch is also an ancestor. The origin of this line is from Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve. Seth can represent to us the element of human consciousness which is most concerned with the holy stewardship of earth which is bestowed upon mankind by God. This can be illustrated through God's commandment of Noah to save the animals from the flood, which was meant to rid the earth from the corruption of the sons of the vengeful Cain. This can provide illustration for the reason that the Seth line was most correlated with the Green Man motif, which appears strongly in British mythology, most notably through the Green Knight. With the advent of Catholicism, the Green Man became a demonised figure due to his connection with nature, which was confined to a position which would resemble the devil, which can be linked to the adjacent demonisation of the Welsh people, culture and language, which will follow the dominance of the Vatican, and which would endure for centuries through their conduits in an effort to suppress Welsh links to early Christianity. The Welsh language has often been called the language of the devil, for example. The Green Man would make a positive reappearance in British churches during the Reformation. The Seth through line through Noah and Enoch were the ones God deemed pure, holy and competent enough not only to build the ark ready to save the animals from the deluge, but also to repopulate Earth. It's possible that Blake was linking Seth's through line of human consciousness to that which is found within the psyche of the British Isles, and in particular the Druids. The Druids of continental Europe and Britain are the descendants of the Levitic priesthood that travelled with the different Israelite tribes across Europe during their dissemination into Europe. The Levites were a priestly caste that lived among the 11 tribes, the other tribes of Israel, and were not granted land of their own. They operated as the law-keepers, musicians, and ceremonialists of each tribe. They are recorded to have been harp players, an instrument associated with Wales and the biblical King David, whose line was brought to Britain through the tribe of Dan and Judah. These Levites would become the Druids of Britain, and from this point can be understood as priest-kings who are able to fill the role of king when needed, and were therefore permitted to use the line of Judah as their heraldry, as Levi has no heraldry. And it must be noted that the Levites were not afforded special dispensation of kingship originally. The notion of priest-kings is one covered by Ben McBrady, the last Druid of the old Gaelic order, who explains in his documentary the purpose of a Druid.
There's a great corpus of written material about St. Patrick and early Christianity in Ireland. Maybe not so well known, but it's loaded with anecdotes and tales about the interaction of the Druids with St. Patrick and his followers and the conflicts between them, and how, above all, the only one who was able to smooth over the problems was MacLugar and his descendants. And MacLugar is in the annals, which are definitive, but were altered to suit. MacLugar, with a number of other filla and scribes, was given the job by St. Patrick of transcribing, putting into writing for the first time, the traditions of the Shenkas Mór. The Shenkas Mór was the great corpus of knowledge. It's well known to modern scholars that the genealogies were meddled with. The lists of the kings were meddled with to fit in with a time scale that was wrong, and to phase out the pagan influence, which was still there, to endeavour to phase it out. So our annals start with the year 432, our written annals, which is the year in which St. Patrick is claimed to have arrived. And to me, I can see MacLugar as one of these great characters who emerge in a few generations and totally transform the character of a society. It has happened. But because of the conflicts between paganism, Christianity, he is written out of history, ultimately. I look on him as the inventor of Christianity after St. Paul. St. Paul invented the Roman Christianity. MacLugar and his group were the philosophers who laid out the main tenets of pure Christianity. What we recognize as pure Christianity was the old religion carried from here to the east. But it does seem that the fountainhead of the ancient Christian ethic was here in Colleen, Cormac. It's a big claim, but over the centuries we have had the phenomenon of thousands upon thousands of Irish missionaries going all over the world, more than any other country, spreading Christianity.
Colleen Cormac is the burial place of Lugar MacLugar and his son Duftall MacLugar. The mortal remains of other Druids, kings and saints are also buried here. Yet Colleen Cormac is not an Irish national monument, nor is it listed in any tourist guide. It is not even signposted. It is a secret and magical place.
MacLugar and his antecedents and his successors lived in an area called Kennel Lugar in County Kildare, which in ancient times was a great marsh. There were two islands in the marsh. One was the settlement of the group, and the other was the temple and the burial place. The ancient stones there make a link with Christianity in that we have the only Ogham stone in Ireland which has both a Latin and an Old Irish inscription written in Ogham, cut in Ogham on the stone.
Ogham is not a language, but an alphabet. The inscription on the stone reads, "For true Druids."
It was one of the places where Jesus, as a wandering scholar, was inducted into the ancient wisdoms of the order, and then returned to Palestine to begin his mission over there. And up to the last century, a place was pointed out as the Jew's house. It didn't mean that that was simply where Jesus stayed, but that was where Jewish scholars were located. Scholars came from all over the world to ancient Ireland, and that drift continued well into medieval times. There were over 5,000 foreign students in the great school. Clonmacnoise had that number, but the more important school was in the Midlands, Clonard, St. Finian's School at Clonard. That was the school where St. Columkill was educated. But you must remember that well up into medieval times, those schools, though purporting, and monastic schools and settlements, though purporting to be Christian, were carrying on a pre-Christian philosophy, religion, observance, and were always in conflict with the...
The philosophies of early Christianity had inherent sentiments of the ancient religion that Druids were connected to. The sun dish behind the cross shows us that Christ was synonymous to the sun to the Druids, which is linked with sun worship noted by Blake at Primrose Hill, and would be expressed through the use of Arwen in the Druidic reboot. McBrady's retelling of his understanding of the Druidic input to Christianity links nicely with Blake's notion of a once and future religion. This leads us naturally to the lost years of Christ and the story of Joseph of Arimathea and his role in supporting the travels of the young Jesus. The memory of Jesus coming to Britain and Ireland around the year 20 is one story which belongs to a series of 3 claims which India and Japan are also involved in. These 3 countries all have narratives of the young Messiah visiting different spiritual teachers before returning to Jerusalem to deliver the gospel. It is claimed by scholars that during the 1st century a network of Jewish mystics named the Essenes had established routes across Europe which would aid in the transportation of ecclesiastical teachings across this network. It would make sense for the Essenes to have been closely connected to the Druids due to a shared Israelite heritage. Wilson and Blackett claimed that the Holy Family returned to Britain after the crucifixion. This makes sense to me, as I'm sure the Holy Family would have found themselves simultaneously outside of the existing Roman Empire and amongst Israelite kin. There is some evidence for the presence of the Arimathea tribe to have married into the British royal families, namely through Anna of Arimathea and her marriage to King Bran, which is recorded in the Welsh genealogies. The arrival of the Holy Family in Britain can be seen as a confirmation of the gospel to the Druids, who on the return of the Holy Family accepted their former student as the Messiah. It must be noted at this point that the Druids had a deity of similar archetypal resonance to the crucifixion. This imago is presented amongst Jewish and Hermetic mystics as well as the Druids, further illustrating the cultural crossover between them. Subsequently, Christianity became fully integrated with the existing Druidic religion, and Britain would become the world's first Christian country. For this reason, Britain in particular, and the Brytholic element of Britain, has been closely linked with the Israelite narrative, as well as early Christianity. There are interesting cultural artifacts which illustrate this. The Welsh patron saint is Dewi Sant. Wilson and Blackett and Ross Broadstock made the argument that Dewi was not originally translation of David, but rather it translates to one with God, alluding to the presence of Christ or the bloodline of Christ in Wales. David was superimposed onto this figure in order to afford the patron saint of Wales a double meaning which can be found in the daffodil. If you look at the outline of the daffodil shape next to the Star of David, it's possible to draw the conclusion that the selection of this symbol is there to represent the line of King David amongst the Welsh and the Welsh king lines, meaning that Saint David simultaneously symbolises the presence of Christ and the David line in Wales. J.R.R Tolkein took a special interest in the Welsh language whilst he was living in Birmingham. He would observe this mysterious language on the side of coal trucks and wished to gain an understanding of what he was confronted with. Tolkien, who was a philologist, would delve into Welsh and Brythonic mythos and language. He would find a cultural pull which would help influence his writing of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien also made the correlation between early Latin and Welsh, and he said that Latin and Welsh appear to have been similar to one another in their phonetic and morphological structure, to a degree unusual between the languages sufficiently so far separated in the history belonging to the 2 different branches of Western Indo-European language. Yet Godlaic, Celtic, seemed to be alien to both the British and the Romans. Tolkien's research is very interesting because it corroborates with the traditional British view of history, which places the Britons as the descendants of the dispersed Trojans who had settled in Etruria in northern Italy before migrating to Britain with Brutus. An interesting episode of history to consider when looking at this is the treatment of Caradoc, the High King of the Britons, in his house arrest during the initial Roman conquest of Britain. Initially, Caradoc was betrayed and was handed over to the Romans. Caradoc wasn't killed by the Romans like other European tribal leaders in this period. Instead, he and his family were taken to the bosom of the Roman court and were treated with great intrigue. It must be mentioned that Caradoc was noted to have given a great speech at the court and that no translator was needed to interpret the message, which corresponds with Tolkien's findings. It must also be noted that Caradoc and his wife and the rest of the family would have been Christian, and that the house arrest of the British royal family can be seen as the nexus point which Christianity was introduced to the inner ring of the Roman elite. In relation to the Welsh-Latin link, the Roman foundation stone has been translated using Welsh and Colburn cipher by my dad, John Griffiths. This translation extracted a message of two brothers vying for eminence in the foundation of a city. This clearly illustrates the Romulus and Remus origin story. The ability to glean a message written in Etruscan through the Welsh language can be seen as an example of how close the two archaic languages were, which confirms the validity of Trojan history of Britain. Interestingly, Tolkien also asserts that the medieval monks spoke the best Latin in Europe, and he attributed that to the similarity between Welsh and archaic Latin. Central to his Middle-earth universe was the concept of the Rings of Power. Tolkien's contemporary C.S. Lewis shared this interest. However, in his book, The Hideous Strength, the Rings of Power referred to an inner ring which resembles a selective group of people within London universities, as well as Oxford and Cambridge, which represent a progressivism, which is opposed to the stiflingly traditional schools of thought. The inner ring which Lewis describes is aligned, I feel, with the politically correct culture that originated in the 1920s, with the Frankfurt School of Thought, which is characterised by its missionary intent to destroy Western phallogocentrism, or in other words, the spiritually patriarchal principles of Western civilization, which are inextricably linked with the Judeo-Christian tradition. Wilson and Blackett write about their experience with what they arguably felt were the manifestations of these attitudes which were popular in the 80s. In their introduction to King Arthur of Glamorgan and Gwent, they recount a time when they approached the London Arts Council to inform them of their research, and in particular, the discovery of King Arthur. To which the Arts Council responded with disparaging remarks, as if to say King Arthur was unfashionable or uninteresting. The disinterest in Britain's once and future king is arguably symptomatic of the sort of progressive agenda which was witnessed by Lewis 40 years earlier. Wilson and Blackett mentioned, and I quote, that the council at the time were using taxpayers' money to fund conceptual pieces of performance art, which included BDSM-style torture, which can inform us about how Wilson and Blackett felt about it, but it also illustrates the cultural zeitgeist of the period, which was considered to be expressive of deconstructionism and rebellion against patriarchal structures and sentiments during the 80s. This cultural flavour can add context to the rejection of Wilson and Blackett amongst cultural authorities during the time they were making their discoveries. I feel this perfectly illustrates the cultural trajectory within some spheres of cultural and political power who wish to deny the return of the king in the culture. C.S. Lewis recognises in his book that historically, in Britain, there are two consciousnesses which are contained in psychic opposition. Lewis refers to the diametric opposition of England and Logres symbolically. Logres is the ancient name of England, which refers to Locrinus, the first son of Brutus, who would be the first king of England in the Cymric Trojan Israelite view of history. To the Welsh, England is still referred to as Lloegr to this day. Lewis describes Logres as the more Cymric, Druidic or Arthurian consciousness of the British Isles, which is in contention with the more Anglo-Saxon-centric consciousness of England. England, therefore, has an alternative bardic identity, which is associated with the deep heritage of the Britons. I feel this notion is what Blake was trying to express. An image which is also illustrated in the prophecy of Merlin, otherwise known as the Matter of Britain, in which Merlin envisions a red dragon and a white dragon fighting under the ground of a castle, which the king of the Britons wishes to build a castle on. Merlin warns the king that it is prophesied that the Britons would lose dominance in Britain to the Anglo-Saxons, and that the Saxons would rule over Britain for millennia, until the return of the rightful king line of Brutus would emerge, a notion that Henry VII and VIII would certainly employ. And despite the unfortunate treatment of the Welsh and all things Welsh by the Tudors, Henry VIII would begin a process that would see Britain separate with Rome and restore ecclesiastical independence to the world's first Christian country, a notion which you can attribute to the prophecies tied to its bloodline. I hope that my efforts to try and tie together some of these elements have done these cultural figures some justice. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and leave a comment.